In 1940, deep inside a marble hall in Berlin, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring listened to reports about America's latest boast. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had just declared that the United States would build 50,000 warplanes a year, an unimaginable number in a world still ruled by European industry. Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, burst out laughing. 50,000 planes, he sneered. They can't even make that many cars right now. Around him, German officers chuckled. America, they believed, was a nation of dreamers, not warriors. It was still licking its wounds from the Great Depression, still arguing about whether to even enter the war. How could such a country outbuild the Third Reich, whose factories already thundered day and night for conquest? But what Göring didn't understand was that America was about to do something no nation in history had ever done before. Within 5 years, the U.S. would transform itself into the most powerful industrial machine the world had ever seen. It would produce not 50,000 planes, but over 100,000. And in doing so, it would bury Nazi Germany under an avalanche of aluminum, oil, and ingenuity. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt stepped to the podium on May 16, 1940, the world was in flames. France was collapsing under the weight of the German blitzkrieg. The skies over Britain were dark with Luftwaffe bombers. America, still officially neutral, watched with growing unease as fascism devoured Europe. Roosevelt knew that neutrality could not last forever. The United States might not yet be at war, but the war was coming for it. And so, in that famous speech to Congress, Roosevelt laid out a challenge so audacious that even his allies hesitated to believe it. "We must build up our defense to the point where we can produce 50,000 planes a year," he declared. The chamber erupted with murmurs. Even among his supporters, the figure sounded absurd. At that moment, the entire U.S. aircraft industry had built fewer than 3,000 planes in 1939. To the Germans, who heard Roosevelt's words through intelligence channels, it was a joke. Göring, presiding over his empire of bombers and fighters, had reason to be confident. The Luftwaffe was unmatched in size and experience. Its factories, Messerschmitt, Heinkel, Junkers, were churning out planes by the thousands. The Americans, Göring scoffed, were amateurs. Their factories made washing machines and sedans, not war machines. He believed that by the time America even began to build those mythical planes, Europe would already be his. He wasn't entirely wrong, at least, not yet. In 1940, the American aircraft industry was still small, scattered, and underfunded. The few major producers, Douglas, Boeing, Lockheed, were working on contracts for small batches of experimental bombers and fighters. The government's procurement process was slow, the military's requirements constantly shifting. Many in Washington doubted whether the country even had enough skilled workers, let alone materials, to meet such an insane goal. But Roosevelt's speech had done something more powerful than order production. It had declared intent. In one stroke, he transformed American industry into a national mission. He called it the arsenal of democracy. The challenge spread like wildfire. Newspapers ran headlines asking if America could truly rise to the task. Some columnists mocked the idea, calling it airplane pipe dreams. Others rallied behind it, arguing that American innovation could do what no dictatorship could match. Henry Ford, the man who had once revolutionized the automobile, declared, "We can build anything, if the government will just let us." Behind closed doors, industrialists, engineers, and generals began to sketch out what would become the largest coordinated manufacturing effort in human history. The plan was staggering. Dozens of new factories would need to be built from scratch, aircraft assembly plants that could swallow entire city blocks. Entire rail lines would have to be dedicated to transporting wings, engines, and aluminum. Hundreds of thousands of workers, many of them women who had never worked a day in heavy industry, would need to be trained almost overnight. While Göring laughed, the Americans began to mobilize. Across the country, workshops that had once built cars, tractors, and refrigerators began retooling for war. Ford broke ground on a facility so massive it defied imagination, Willow Run, an aircraft plant outside Detroit designed to build one bomber every hour. In California, Lockheed expanded its Burbank facility, constructing new hangars faster than the concrete could set. Boeing, Douglas, and North American Aviation ramped up production lines for bombers and fighters that were still in prototype. It was chaos at first. Engineers worked day and night to figure out how to mass-produce machines that had never been built in such numbers. Supply chains tangled, mistakes were constant. But the momentum was unstoppable. Roosevelt had set the target, and America was moving to hit it. Meanwhile, in Europe, Göring continued to underestimate what was coming. The Luftwaffe, though formidable, was already showing cracks. The Battle of Britain had drained its resources. Its factories, bombed by the RAF, could not keep up with demand. Its training schools were short of fuel and pilots. Yet Göring still bragged to his generals that Germany's air supremacy would last 1,000 years. Far across the ocean, however, the groundwork was being laid for his downfall. American industrial might, once mocked as clumsy and inefficient, was awakening. Within 2 years, entire cities would echo with the sound of rivet guns, the skies would darken with B-17s and P-51s, and Göring's laughter would be replaced by disbelief. He had laughed at Roosevelt's 50,000 plane dream. Soon, that number would look small. When Roosevelt made his bold promise of 50,000 planes a year, few outside his inner circle realized that America had just declared an industrial revolution. The challenge wasn't only about building aircraft, it was about reinventing how a nation made anything at all. The U.S. didn't just need to produce more, it needed to produce differently, faster, and smarter than any country had ever imagined possible. In 1941, before Pearl Harbor even pulled the United States into open war, the effort was already underway. Massive government contracts began pouring into private companies. Ford, General Motors, Lockheed, Boeing, Douglas, and North American Aviation were given a task that seemed absurd even to them: build factories big enough to produce warplanes like cars. They had no blueprint for this. But what they did have was American industrial DNA, an instinct for scaling up, for assembly lines, for turning craftsmanship into mass production. The Ford Motor Company's engineers became the center of that experiment. Henry Ford's son, Edsel, along with a team of visionary managers, began designing a facility unlike any ever seen on Earth, the Willow Run bomber plant in Ypsilanti, Michigan. It would cover 67 acres of factory floor, employ over 40,000 workers, and assemble the B-24 Liberator, one of the largest and most complex aircraft of the war. At first, experts said it couldn't be done. The B-24 had 1.25 million parts, more than 300,000 rivets, and miles of wiring. It took skilled craftsmen weeks to build one by hand. Ford's engineers wanted to make one every hour. Critics scoffed. Airplanes weren't cars, they couldn't be cranked out by a moving assembly line. But the Ford team believed otherwise. They studied every step of the process, broke it down, and reorganized it. Parts were standardized, wings were built in sections, and the plane literally moved on a conveyor from station to station. By 1943, Willow Run was turning out bombers faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. The plant's motto became legend: we lose one B-24 every hour, but we build one every hour, too. And Willow Run was just one piece of the puzzle. Across the country, new facilities were rising from the dirt. Boeing's plants in Seattle and Wichita became hives of activity, rolling out B-17 flying fortresses day and night. North American Aviation turned out thousands of P-51 Mustangs and B-25 Mitchells. Douglas aircraft in California filled the skies with C-47 transports and A-20 bombers. Even smaller companies, like Republic Aviation, Curtiss-Wright, and Bell, expanded beyond anything they had ever attempted. The numbers began to snowball. In 1941, America built 19,000 planes. In 1942, it built 47,000. By 1943, production hit 86,000. And in 1944, the United States produced 96,000 aircraft, nearly twice what Roosevelt had once promised. But behind those staggering figures were people, millions of them, whose lives were transformed by the effort. As men went to war, women poured into the factories. They became riveters, welders, and machinists. The phrase, Rosie the Riveter, became more than propaganda. It was a symbol of an entire generation of women who kept the machines of democracy running. At Willow Run alone, 30,000 women worked side by side with men, building bombers that would later carpet Europe with the force that crushed the Luftwaffe. The aircraft industry became the beating heart of America's new wartime economy. From California to Connecticut, whole towns sprang up around the factories. Cafes, schools, and houses were built for workers who lived and breathed production. Train lines delivered aluminum, rubber, and steel in endless streams. At night, the glow of the assembly plants lit the horizon like cities of glass and fire. Meanwhile, in Washington, the War Production Board coordinated the chaos. Headed by industrial genius Donald Nelson, it rationed materials, allocated labor, and ensured that every bolt, rivet, and gallon of fuel went where it was needed most. Nelson once said, "This is not an industry anymore, it's an organism." The Germans began to notice. In intercepted radio chatter, Luftwaffe officers complained that new American bombers seemed to appear faster than they could destroy them. The sky, once ruled by the Luftwaffe, was becoming crowded with silver giants bearing white stars. Göring, who had once mocked America's industrial limits, began receiving reports he didn't believe. Intelligence suggested that the Allies were building four-engine bombers faster than Germany could build single-engine fighters. He dismissed it as propaganda. But on the front lines, his pilots saw the truth. In daylight raids, they faced wave after wave of B-17s escorted by P-51 Mustangs that ranged deep into Germany, flying farther and faster than anything the Reich could field. For every bomber they shot down, another seemed to take its place. It wasn't just a battle of machines, it was a battle of factories, and Germany was losing. Inside those American plants, there was pride and exhaustion in equal measure. The work was endless, noisy, and dangerous. Yet workers knew what they were building mattered. Many of them had family members fighting overseas. Every bomber that rolled off the line might carry a son, a brother, or a husband. In that sense, each rivet was personal. By 1944, the goal Roosevelt had set, a goal that Göring had mocked, wasn't just met. It was obliterated. The U.S. aircraft industry had produced more planes in 1 year than Germany and Japan combined could build in 2. It was an industrial miracle on a scale the world had never seen before, and it was only getting started. Because next, America's factories would turn that production into power, and unleash it across the skies of Europe. By the summer of 1943, the skies over Europe were changing color. Once ruled by the black crosses of the Luftwaffe, they now shimmered with silver, the polished wings of American bombers and fighters that filled the horizon from horizon to horizon. Göring's empire, built on the myth of air supremacy, was being dismantled piece by the very machines he had mocked 3 years earlier. At airfields across England, the morning ritual became almost mechanical. Thousands of men awoke before dawn, the cold English mist clinging to the tarmac as ground crews prepared another wave of aircraft. Rows upon rows of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators stood like steel giants, their fuselages marked with names: Memphis Belle, Thunderbird, Sky Queen. Engines roared to life, shattering the stillness as formation after formation took off, climbing into the clouds. To German radar operators, those days began with panic. What had once been a few dozen enemy aircraft was now hundreds, then thousands, their echoes filling the scopes like a swarm of bees. The Reich's air defense network, once efficient and deadly, was overwhelmed. The Americans had achieved something that even the Luftwaffe couldn't: scale. Every bomber carried a crew of 10, pilots, navigators, gunners, engineers, all depending on the relentless production that had filled the hangars back home. Behind each mission were the factories of Boeing, Ford, and Lockheed, the sweat of workers in Detroit, Seattle, and Burbank, and the millions of rivets and gallons of 100-octane fuel that powered the arsenal of democracy. Göring's laugh, once so full of confidence, had turned into silence. The turning point came not just from the bombers, but from the sleek, deadly fighters that began to accompany them, the P-51 Mustang. Powered by the British-designed Rolls-Royce Merlin engine but built in American factories, it became the Luftwaffe's nightmare. The Mustang could fly higher, faster, and farther than any German fighter, and it could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. It was the embodiment of American industrial and technical collaboration at its peak. When the Mustangs first appeared over Germany in early 1944, German pilots couldn't believe their eyes. The bombers were no longer easy prey. Every time a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf swooped in, a Mustang was there to intercept it. The hunters had become the hunted. American production didn't just build machines, it built persistence. Göring's pilots, once the elite of Europe, found themselves flying against waves of opponents who never seemed to run out. For every Mustang shot down, another appeared. For every bomber destroyed, 10 more took its place the next morning. Luftwaffe training programs collapsed under the strain, fuel shortages crippled their readiness. And while German factories struggled to replace lost planes, American factories were already producing next-generation models. Back home, newspapers printed photos of the Allied air fleets filling the skies. Civilians marveled at the sheer scale. In some bomber formations, there were so many aircraft in the air at once that pilots joked they could walk to Berlin on the wings. The sight of 1,000 bombers flying in formation became both a symbol of inevitability and a psychological weapon. Germany could no longer pretend that its borders were safe. In the fall of 1944, the Allies began to strike directly at the industrial heart of the Reich: synthetic oil plants, rail yards, factories, and shipyards. American bombers, guided by precise Norden bomb sights, leveled targets that had taken Germany years to build. The Luftwaffe tried to fight back, but it was like throwing stones at a tidal wave. Entire cities trembled under the roar of bombers powered by the same industrial system that Göring had once dismissed as a fantasy. For the Americans who flew those missions, the scale of their own air power was breathtaking. Pilots described the skies as alive with silver. Some compared it to watching a storm form over the earth, a man-made hurricane of steel. They didn't always know how many bombers flew beside them, only that it felt infinite. Every one of those aircraft was a testament to logistics, the supply chains that never faltered, the convoys that crossed the Atlantic, the workers who labored through the night to replace what was lost. The Red Ball Express carried fuel, the Liberty ships carried aluminum, and the refineries of Texas and California fed the planes that darkened Europe's skies. Even as Germany tried to adapt, it was too late. The Luftwaffe's pilot schools couldn't keep up with losses. Teenagers were being rushed into cockpits with barely 100 hours of flight time. Aircraft fuel was rationed to the point that pilots couldn't train properly. Factories were bombed faster than they could rebuild. Göring still held grand parades in Berlin, but the reality on the ground was grim. His once proud Air Force was bleeding out. American airfields, meanwhile, ran like clockwork. Mechanics rotated between shifts, new aircraft arrived daily, and replacement crews were trained and ready. By 1944, the United States wasn't just supplying its own forces, it was supplying the Allies. British squadrons flew American-built bombers, Soviet units received shipments of P-39 Airacobras and B-25s. The arsenal of democracy had gone global. And through it all, Göring watched in disbelief as his prediction crumbled. The Reich he had promised would rule the air for 1,000 years couldn't even hold it for 5. The Americans had not just matched his ambition, they had buried it under the weight of numbers, innovation, and resolve. Every contrail that streaked across the German sky was another reminder: what had begun as Roosevelt's impossible dream was now an unstoppable reality. And the laughter that had once echoed through Berlin's marble halls had been drowned out by the roar of 100,000 engines. By early 1945, the skies over Germany no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. They belonged to the enemy, the very enemy Hermann Göring had once ridiculed. The Reichsmarshal who had laughed at Roosevelt's 50,000 planes promise now lived in a world where American aircraft outnumbered his own by 10 to 1. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Hitler's war machine, was dying, not from lack of courage, but from starvation. Factories were in ruins. Supply lines were broken. Fuel had become so scarce that fighter pilots were told to taxi their planes using horses to save gasoline for combat. In training schools, cadets learned maneuvers using wooden mock-ups because there was no fuel to fly. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, American factories were still building bombers and fighters faster than ever, an endless tide of aluminum, steel, and horsepower. It wasn't just the planes that crushed the Luftwaffe, it was the machinery behind them. The United States had mastered the art of industrial warfare. Its assembly lines were synchronized, its logistics systems precise, its workers motivated. While German aircraft designers struggled to get parts from bombed-out factories, American engineers were producing new engines, propellers, and avionics by the hundreds of thousands. At the center of it all were the airfields of England, vast, organized, and humming with life. Each morning, they came alive with activity, ground crews loading bombs, fuel trucks racing between lines of parked planes, and pilots receiving their briefings in crowded hangars. Then came the thunder. Hundreds of aircraft roared down the runways and lifted into the gray sky. From the ground, it looked like an endless swarm, formation after formation, wave after wave, bound for Germany. Inside Berlin, Göring was facing the unthinkable. Reports from his generals painted a picture of collapse. Fuel reserves were nearly gone, production of aircraft had dropped to a fraction of its 1942 levels, and experienced pilots were all but extinct. The Luftwaffe's once fearsome aces, men like Galland, Marseille, and Hartmann, were either dead, grounded, or overwhelmed. New pilots were being sent into battle with only a handful of flight hours, many dying on their first mission. Göring's once boastful declarations about a 1,000-year Reich were now bitter echoes of failure. American bombers, powered by the same industrial miracle he had laughed at, now flew over German cities in broad daylight without fear. Their contrails crisscrossed the sky like white scars, visible proof that the war had turned irrevocably against the Reich. Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, all burned under the combined weight of Allied air power. Göring's Luftwaffe, which had once terrorized London, now couldn't protect its own people. Inside American factories, workers followed the news with grim pride. Every headline about another successful raid was a validation of their labor. The women at Willow Run, Boeing, and Douglas knew that the planes they built were not just machines, they were the hands of vengeance, reaching across the Atlantic to finish the job. Posters hung on factory walls read, "The faster you work, the sooner they come home." And they worked. Day and night, shifts ran around the clock. Riveters, machinists, and welders kept the lines moving, often 7 days a week. When something broke, it was repaired immediately. When a part ran short, substitutes were designed on the fly. The sheer adaptability of the American system stunned even its allies. A single plant in California could switch from building bombers to fighters in less than a week. It was chaos organized into efficiency, a living embodiment of Roosevelt's vision. On the battlefield, the results were undeniable. The P-51 Mustang now ruled the skies, chasing down Me-109s and FW-190s with ruthless precision. The B-17s and B-24s turned entire industrial regions into rubble. The German High Command tried to adapt, launching the jet-powered Me-262 in a desperate bid to regain control. But even this technological marvel came too late, and in too few numbers. For every Me-262 that took off, 10 P-51s were waiting. In one bitterly ironic moment, Göring himself was forced to admit what he had once denied. As Allied bombers struck another fuel refinery, he reportedly muttered to an aide, "If the Americans can build planes like this faster than we can shoot them down, the war is lost." It was not an exaggeration, it was the truth. The Luftwaffe's collapse wasn't just military. It was psychological. German pilots who once believed in invincibility now flew missions with the knowledge that their chances of survival were slim. The constant roar of enemy bombers overhead became the soundtrack of Germany's defeat. Even civilians began to understand what Göring had never wanted to admit: industrial power, not ideology, would decide the war. By late 1944, Göring had become a ghost of his former self. The flamboyant uniforms, the medals, the bravado, all were hollow now. Hitler, furious at his failures, accused him of cowardice and incompetence. Göring withdrew into a haze of morphine and denial, still pretending that a miracle might save the Luftwaffe. But the miracle had already happened, it was just on the other side. While Germany's skies filled with smoke, America's filled with victory. The 50,000 plane dream had not only come true, it had doubled, even tripled in scope. In 1945, when Allied planes dropped supplies over liberated Europe, many bore the same insignia as those that had once dropped bombs. The arsenal of democracy had become an arsenal of humanity. And as Göring's world collapsed in ruins, the irony was complete. He had laughed at Roosevelt's fantasy, but it was that fantasy, made real by millions of ordinary workers, engineers, and pilots, that had turned the tide of history. When the war finally ended in 1945, the noise that had once filled the skies fell silent. The endless roar of engines, the whistle of bombs, the hum of assembly lines, all faded into a kind of stunned quiet. But beneath that silence was something profound, the realization that America's greatest weapon had never been a single airplane, a tank, or a bomb. It had been its ability to build, to produce at a scale so vast, so relentless, that no enemy could keep up. And it had all started with one boast from Hermann Göring, and one impossible promise from Franklin D. Roosevelt. The numbers told a story that defied comprehension. By the time Germany surrendered, the United States had produced 300,000 aircraft of every type: fighters, bombers, transports, and trainers. It had built more warplanes in 4 years than all the Axis powers combined. Factories that hadn't existed in 1940 were now monuments to industrial might. Boeing alone had produced nearly 13,000 B-17s. Douglas turned out over 10,000 C-47s. North American Aviation built more than 15,000 P-51 Mustangs. The figures were so high that even the military struggled to store and deploy them all. But the legacy of that production wasn't just in numbers, it was in transformation. America had redefined what a nation could do when its full potential was unleashed. The 50,000 plane challenge had forced an entire society to think differently about work, efficiency, and innovation. The boundaries between civilian and military life had blurred, creating a single, unified purpose. Housewives became welders. Teachers became machinists. Teenagers delivered parts on bicycles to plants the size of small cities. A culture built on consumer goods had turned itself into an engine of survival. The genius of it all was that it wasn't built on command, it was built on collaboration. Industrialists like Henry Ford, Donald Douglas, and William Knudsen worked side by side with military planners, economists, and labor leaders. The government didn't simply order production, it coordinated it. The War Production Board turned competition into cooperation, encouraging companies to share designs, standardize components, and eliminate inefficiency. Rival firms that had once battled for market share now built the same aircraft, using interchangeable parts. The result was a war machine that functioned more like a living organism than an industry. And its impact stretched far beyond the battlefield. When American troops marched through liberated Europe, they did so under skies filled with U.S. aircraft. When Allied bombers delivered food to the starving in the Netherlands or airdropped supplies to prisoners of war, they flew in planes made by the same workers who had once built instruments of destruction. The arsenal of democracy became an arsenal of mercy. The same industrial power that had crushed the Axis now rebuilt the world it had saved. Even Germany, shattered by the bombing campaigns that Göring had been powerless to stop, would eventually rise again with the help of that same industrial engine. American factories retooled from bombers to bulldozers, from tanks to tractors. The post-war boom that followed, new homes, new cars, new highways, was born from the lessons of wartime production. The skills learned by welders, engineers, and designers in those frantic years fueled the greatest economic expansion in history. For historians, the irony was inescapable. Göring had believed that air power was measured in machines. Roosevelt understood that it was measured in capacity, the ability to adapt, to outthink, and to outbuild the enemy. The Luftwaffe had peaked early, its brilliance constrained by scarcity. The Americans, slower to start, built momentum that became unstoppable. When Göring once sneered that the United States could never build 50,000 planes, he unknowingly defined his own defeat. Because in trying to prove him wrong, America discovered the limits of what was possible, and then broke them. For the men who flew those planes, the legacy was personal. Pilots of the 8th Air Force remembered looking out their cockpit windows over Germany and seeing nothing but silver wings, stretching from one horizon to the other. It was like flying inside a machine that covered the whole sky, one veteran said. That's when I knew we couldn't lose. The sense of invincibility didn't come from arrogance, it came from awareness. They knew that behind every sortie was an entire nation, building, repairing, replacing, and pushing them forward. When Göring was captured at the end of the war, he was no longer the laughing showman who had once ridiculed American ambition. Photographs from his interrogation show a man bloated, weary, and broken. During questioning, Allied officers reminded him of his old boasts, that America's industry was too soft to sustain a war. Göring reportedly sighed and said, "We lost when I saw the factories. We could not fight machines that never stopped." He was right. In the end, the real war was not fought in the skies over Berlin, but on the assembly lines of Detroit, Seattle, and Los Angeles. It was fought by men and women who never saw the front lines but whose hands built the machines that decided its fate. The story of Roosevelt's 50,000 plane challenge is not just a tale of industrial triumph. It's a reminder of what belief, organization, and sheer willpower can achieve when the stakes are existential. In that race to outbuild tyranny, America didn't just create airplanes, it created a model for modern power. And so, Göring's laughter, once the sound of Nazi confidence, became the echo of their undoing. Because while he mocked America's dream of 50,000 planes, the United States built 100,000, and in doing so, built the world that would follow.